What began as a political flex has escalated into one of the most consequential trade confrontations in modern North American history. Donald Trump's renewed gamble against Canada was meant to project dominance, revive nationalist fervor, and reassert unilateral control over global trade. Instead, it exposed the fragility of coercive diplomacy and ignited economic, legal, and political shockwaves that now ripple through markets, courts, and households. This documentary examines who truly gains and who pays the price when power politics collide with rules-based systems, and why this showdown may redefine America's credibility, governance, and future stability. Donald Trump and the White House power gamble. Donald Trump returned to the presidency determined to prove that confrontation equals strength. The trade standoff with Canada was never merely about tariffs, dairy quotas, or aluminum exports. It was a test of dominance. From the White House perspective, Canada appeared to be the ideal target. Economically intertwined, militarily allied, politically restrained, and historically deferential. Trump's team believed Ottawa would fold quickly under threats, validating his long-held belief that fear is the most efficient negotiating tool. In the short term, this posture energized his political base, reinforced his image as a decisive strongman, and reaffirmed his brand as the so-called tariff man who bends other nations to America's will. But this gamble came with immediate costs. Trump's strategy relied on spectacle rather than preparation, grievance rather than data. By framing Canada as an adversary instead of a partner, the administration underestimated both Canadian institutional capacity and the economic reality of North American integration. This miscalculation transformed what could have been a managed dispute into a cascading crisis. The White House found itself trapped between rhetoric and reality, unable to escalate without severe domestic consequences, yet psychologically incapable of backing down without appearing weak. Politically, Trump initially benefited from the confrontation. The narrative of standing up to unfair trade partners played well with hardline supporters who view multilateral agreements as constraints on American sovereignty. Conservative media amplified the message, portraying Canada as exploiting U.S. markets while hiding behind politeness and climate diplomacy. For a brief moment, the White House reclaimed control of the news cycle, casting Trump as a leader willing to do what others wouldn't. However, the downside emerged rapidly. As markets reacted, prices rose, and industries sounded alarms. The administration's lack of an exit strategy became apparent. The same absolutism that fuels Trump's appeal also narrows his options. Admitting error would fracture the mythology of infallibility he has built around himself. Escalating, on the other hand, risked inflation spikes, manufacturing shutdowns, and political backlash heading into the 2026 midterms. The president was no longer dictating events. He was reacting to them. Legally, the White House placed itself on dangerous ground. Invoking emergency economic powers against a treaty ally strained constitutional boundaries and invited scrutiny not just from opponents, but from conservative legal circles traditionally sympathetic to executive authority. The administration framed this as a national security necessity, yet struggled to articulate how Canadian dairy or aluminum constituted an emergency threat. This gap between justification and action weakened institutional credibility and emboldened challenges from business groups, courts, and even members of Trump's own coalition. The most profound negative impact, however, was reputational. Allies around the world watched closely. If the United States could weaponize emergency powers against its closest neighbor over a trade dispute, no agreement felt secure. Trust, once broken, cannot be restored by force. While Trump may have sought to project strength, the outcome instead suggested volatility, unpredictability, and personal impulse overriding national interest. Still, from Trump's perspective, the conflict reinforced a core belief: loyalty matters more than legality, dominance more than cooperation. Canada's refusal to comply was interpreted not as sovereign resistance, but as betrayal. This mindset explains why compromise became impossible. The White House wasn't negotiating policy, it was defending ego. And when governance becomes personal, institutions bend, markets tremble, and consequences multiply. In the end, Trump's trade gamble revealed both the power and the peril of leadership driven by confrontation. It rallied supporters but alienated allies. It asserted authority but weakened legitimacy. and it placed the White House at the center of a storm where every outcome carried risk: economic, legal, and political. The question was no longer whether the strategy would succeed, but how much damage it would inflict before it ended. Canada, Mark Carney, and the power of strategic restraint. If Donald Trump's approach was rooted in intimidation and speed, Canada's response was built on patience, preparation, and institutional discipline. At the center of this counter-strategy stood Mark Carney, cast by Trump's narrative as a globalist villain, but operating instead as a stabilizing force. From Canada's perspective, the confrontation was not unexpected. Ottawa had spent years preparing for the possibility of Trump's return, quietly assembling legal teams, economic models, and retaliatory frameworks designed not to escalate chaos, but to survive it. Canada's first major advantage was clarity. Unlike the White House, which framed the conflict emotionally, Canada treated it as a rules-based dispute. Carney and his advisors consistently pointed back to the USMCA, an agreement negotiated and signed by Trump himself. Their message was simple and devastatingly effective. If the United States believes the treaty has been violated, there is a process. If Washington ignores that process, Canada will respond proportionally, legally, and precisely. This calm insistence on procedure denied Trump the emotional battlefield he thrives on. The positive impact for Canada was immediate in one crucial area: credibility. Markets respond to predictability, and Canada projected exactly that. While the White House oscillated between threats and reversals, Ottawa maintained a steady tone. No insults, no midnight social media rants, just numbers, supply chains, and treaty clauses. This approach reassured investors and international partners that Canada was not spiraling into reactionary nationalism. Instead, it positioned itself as the adult in the room, a country defending its interests without dismantling the system that supports them. Economically, Canada leveraged structural asymmetry. While the United States is the larger economy, Canada is the more dependent trading partner, meaning it had already calculated how to absorb pain and redirect trade. By announcing contingency talks with the European Union and the United Kingdom, Canada signaled something Trump's strategy had failed to account for: alternatives exist. Energy exports, critical minerals, and agricultural goods could be diverted. That announcement alone triggered panic inside the White House because it shattered the illusion that America owns the North American market by default. Still, Canada did not emerge unscathed. Retaliatory tariffs and trade uncertainty hurt Canadian exporters, particularly in manufacturing and energy sectors closely tied to U.S. infrastructure. Short-term disruptions were unavoidable. Some industries faced layoffs. Regional governments felt pressure. Yet politically, these costs were absorbed with remarkable unity. Trump's aggression had the unintended effect of consolidating Canadian public opinion. Liberals, conservatives, business leaders, and labor groups largely aligned behind the government's stance. In trying to divide Canada, Trump unified it. There was also a strategic psychological victory. Trump's playbook depends on forcing opponents into reactive positions, angry responses that can be framed as weakness or hostility. Canada refused to take the bait. Each measured response amplified the contrast between volatility and stability. Over time, this contrast eroded Trump's leverage. As inflation fears mounted in the United States, Canadian officials simply pointed to arithmetic. Canada buys more from the U.S. than it sells. In a tariff war, the math favors restraint, not bravado. On the global stage, Canada's posture strengthened its diplomatic standing. Allies watching from Europe and Asia saw a middle power successfully resist coercion without abandoning alliances or norms. That lesson matters. It suggests that power does not always flow from size or aggression, but from preparedness and legitimacy. Canada became a case study in how to confront a disruptive superpower without becoming one. Yet this strategy carried long-term risks. By standing firm, Canada accepted the possibility of prolonged tension with its largest trading partner. Supply chain realignments take time. Political wins in Washington are unpredictable. Still, Ottawa judged that surrendering the rules-based order would be far more costly than enduring short-term pain. In that sense, Canada wasn't just defending its economy, it was defending the principle that agreements matter. Ultimately, Canada's response exposed the weakness at the heart of Trump's approach. Strength without discipline collapses under pressure. By refusing to blink, Canada didn't humiliate the United States. It forced it to confront its own contradictions. And in doing so, Ottawa shifted the balance of the conflict from raw power to systemic resilience, leaving the White House scrambling for an off-ramp it never planned. The American economy and the workers caught in the crossfire. While the trade confrontation played out between capitals and courtrooms, its most immediate and tangible effects landed far from Washington and Ottawa, on factory floors, farm fields, and household budgets across the United States. The administration framed the dispute as a patriotic stand, but for American workers, the conflict quickly revealed itself as a source of instability, uncertainty, and economic anxiety. The very people promised protection became collateral damage in a high-stakes political gamble. The interconnected nature of the U.S.-Canada economy meant that even the threat of tariffs triggered consequences. Auto manufacturing was among the first sectors to feel the shock. Modern vehicle production depends on components crossing the border multiple times before final assembly. When Canada announced targeted retaliatory measures, plants in Ohio, Michigan, and Indiana faced the prospect of disrupted supply chains and temporary shutdowns. Executives warned of layoffs not because demand had collapsed, but because predictability had. For workers living paycheck to paycheck, that distinction meant little. American farmers found themselves in an equally precarious position. Canada is one of the largest export markets for U.S. agricultural goods, particularly dairy, grains, and meat products. Retaliatory tariffs and the threat of border disruptions put contracts at risk, just as many farmers were recovering from previous trade conflicts. Unlike political rhetoric, export markets cannot be rebuilt overnight. Once buyers find alternative suppliers, trust erodes. For rural communities already strained by consolidation and debt, the confrontation revived fears of a repeat of earlier trade wars that required billions in federal aid to stabilize. Energy markets added another layer of vulnerability. U.S. refineries in the Midwest are designed specifically to process Canadian crude. As trade tensions escalated, price volatility spiked. Energy traders began pricing in risk premiums, driving up fuel costs. For consumers, this translated into higher transportation and heating expenses. For businesses, it meant rising operating costs at a time when inflation was already a sensitive political issue. The administration's insistence that tariffs are paid by foreigners collapsed under the weight of basic economics. Costs passed through supply chains always arrive at the consumer. Yet the negative impacts were not evenly distributed, and this imbalance mattered politically. While Wall Street initially absorbed the shock with caution, Main Street felt it immediately. Small manufacturers lacked the buffers of multinational corporations. Over time, hours were cut. Expansion plans were shelved. In suburban districts and industrial swing states, the trade conflict began to reshape voter sentiment. Chaos, more than ideology, became the defining concern. Stability is not an abstract value for workers. It is the difference between security and precarity. Still, the administration attempted to reframe the pain as sacrifice. The argument was familiar: endure short-term hardship for long-term gain. But unlike previous industrial transitions, there was no clear roadmap, no defined end state. The objectives shifted from renegotiation to punishment to symbolic dominance. Without clarity, patience eroded. Polling reflected this shift. Approval ratings dipped sharply in regions directly affected by trade exposure, undercutting Trump's core claim to economic stewardship. There were, however, limited beneficiaries. Certain domestic producers saw temporary price advantages as imports faced tariffs. Some industries welcomed protection from competition, at least initially. But these gains were narrow and fragile. When downstream costs rose, even protected sectors faced reduced demand. Protection without coordination often creates as many losers as winners, and in this case, more. Perhaps the most damaging consequence was psychological. Confidence drives economic behavior. When businesses and consumers fear erratic policy, they retreat. Investment freezes, hiring slows. This self-reinforcing cycle is difficult to reverse, and it placed the Federal Reserve and fiscal planners in a reactive posture. The possibility of a policy-induced recession, one rooted not in external shocks but in political decisions, became a serious concern. In the end, American workers were never the intended targets of the trade gamble, but they became its primary victims. The conflict revealed a stark truth. Economic nationalism, when executed without strategy or restraint, often harms those it claims to defend. As factories braced for disruptions and farmers watched markets slip away, the promise of protection rang hollow. The costs were real, immediate, and deeply personal, and they reshaped the political landscape far beyond the confines of the trade dispute itself, the courts, the Constitution, and the battle over executive power. As the economic consequences mounted, the confrontation migrated from markets to courtrooms, transforming a trade dispute into a constitutional showdown. What began as a policy conflict now threatened to redefine the balance of power within the American system itself. The Trump administration's decision to invoke the International Emergency Economic Powers Act against Canada, America's closest treaty ally, triggered alarm not just among political opponents, but within the legal establishment that traditionally defers to presidential authority. The filing by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce marked a turning point. This was not a partisan attack. It was the largest business lobby in the country declaring that the president had crossed a legal red line. Their argument was devastating in its simplicity. Emergency powers exist to confront terrorists, hostile regimes, and existential threats, not to strong-arm allies in a trade dispute the Constitution assigns to Congress. By bypassing the legislative branch, the administration was not merely imposing tariffs, it was asserting unilateral power over taxation itself. The positive consequence of this legal challenge was immediate institutional clarity. For the first time in years, courts were forced to examine the outer limits of executive authority in real time, under real economic pressure. Judges, some appointed by Trump, expressed open skepticism during hearings. Questions that would once have been unthinkable were asked aloud. How does Canadian milk threaten national security? Where is the emergency? What stops a future president from using the same logic against any state, industry, or political opponent? These questions mattered because they struck at the core of constitutional governance. Article 1 grants Congress the power to regulate commerce and levy taxes. Emergency statutes were never intended to erase that boundary. Legal experts from across the ideological spectrum warned that allowing this maneuver would effectively transfer legislative authority to the executive branch. What was at stake was not just a tariff regime, but the precedent that law follows power rather than constraining it. For Trump, the legal battle was both a risk and an opportunity. On one hand, an adverse ruling would represent a rare institutional rebuke, undermining his image of dominance and exposing limits he has long resisted. On the other, the conflict fed his narrative of persecution. Attacks on the judiciary, accusations of bias, and claims of a deep state conspiracy became tools to mobilize supporters. In this framing, the courts were no longer arbiters of law, they were obstacles to be crushed or delegitimized. The danger of this approach was cumulative. Each attack on judicial independence eroded public trust in the system meant to resolve disputes peacefully. If courts are seen as partisan actors, their rulings lose legitimacy. That erosion does not end with one administration. It lingers, weakening the very mechanisms designed to prevent authoritarian drift. Legal scholars drew comparisons to historic moments when executive overreach forced judicial intervention, noting that such confrontations often define eras. Yet there was also resilience on display. The judiciary moved quickly, recognizing that uncertainty itself carries economic cost. Businesses froze investment while awaiting clarity. Markets watched closely. The legal system, often criticized for slowness, demonstrated that when constitutional stakes are high, it can act decisively. This response reassured some observers that institutional guardrails, though strained, were not yet broken. Internationally, the legal battle sent mixed signals. Allies welcomed the prospect of judicial restraint on executive excess, but the fact that such restraint was necessary at all raised doubts. A system that relies on courts to undo presidential actions after damage has begun is not a stable negotiating partner. For Canada and others, the lesson was sobering. Treaties are only as strong as the domestic politics that uphold them. In the broader arc of the crisis, the courtroom became the arena where democracy tested itself. Would law constrain power, or would power redefine law? The outcome would reverberate far beyond tariffs, shaping how future presidents wield emergency authority. This was no longer just a trade war, it was a struggle over whether the presidency remains a constitutional office or evolves into something far more dangerous: political fallout, global credibility, and the future of U.S. leadership. As the trade confrontation stretched on, its effects converged into a broader political and geopolitical reckoning. What began as a bilateral dispute with Canada metastasized into a referendum on American leadership, institutional stability, and the meaning of power in a rules-based world. The domestic political consequences were immediate, but the international implications may prove far more enduring. Inside the United States, the Republican Party found itself under mounting strain. Business leaders, donors, and industry groups, long pillars of Republican economic credibility, grew openly alarmed. Stock markets began pricing in the risk of a policy-induced recession. Manufacturers and exporters warned lawmakers that uncertainty, not competition, was now the primary threat. For Republican senators in swing states, the trade war with Canada became a political nightmare. Suburban voters, already weary of volatility, recoiled from what looked like self-inflicted chaos. At the same time, the party's ideological fracture deepened. Moderates urged de-escalation, arguing that stability wins elections. The hardline faction demanded escalation, viewing Canada as a symbolic enemy in a broader cultural struggle against globalization and liberalism. Trump stood between these camps, constrained by his own rhetoric. To retreat risked alienating the base. To advance risked economic damage that could wipe out congressional majorities. This paralysis exposed the limits of governance driven by perpetual confrontation. For Democrats, the crisis presented an opportunity. The narrative was almost too clean. A president breaking treaties, threatening allies, ignoring courts, and raising prices for working families. Empty factories and higher grocery bills became visual proof points. Campaign strategists framed the dispute as Exhibit A in the case against chaos. The message was not ideological, it was practical. Competence versus impulsiveness, stability versus spectacle. As history has shown, voters rarely reward leaders who gamble with their livelihoods. Globally, the damage cut deeper. Allies watched as the United States treated a NATO partner as an adversary and attempted to coerce compliance through emergency powers. The signal was unmistakable. American commitments are contingent, personal, and reversible. For countries weighing security cooperation, trade agreements, or long-term investment, this unpredictability was corrosive. Trust, once lost, reshapes alliances. Canada's outreach to Europe was not just a tactic, it was a warning that diversification is now a survival strategy. Ironically, this shift weakened American leverage. Power in the modern world flows through networks, trade, finance, technology, and alliances. By undermining those networks, the administration reduced its own influence. Even rivals took note. When a superpower appears willing to weaponize instability, it encourages others to hedge, decouple, and seek autonomy. That fragmentation diminishes collective strength and accelerates a multipolar reality where American leadership is optional rather than central. There were also institutional consequences that will outlast any single administration. Each norm broken becomes easier to break again. Each law stretched becomes thinner. If emergency powers can be repurposed for political convenience, future presidents of any party will inherit a dangerous precedent. The question facing the nation was no longer about Trump alone, but about what kind of presidency would follow. In this sense, the Canada confrontation became a mirror. It reflected the tension between impulse and restraint, dominance and legitimacy, spectacle and governance. The outcome would shape not just trade policy, but the identity of American power itself. Is leadership defined by the ability to coerce or by the capacity to build systems others choose to join? As the legal battles continued and economic effects deepened, one truth crystallized. This was not a temporary flare-up. It was a structural moment. The choices made here would echo through elections, alliances, and institutions for years to come. And whether the United States emerges diminished or renewed depends on which lesson it ultimately chooses to learn.